Hi everyone, my name is Meghna Thomas, and today I'm going to be discussing the complicated issue of the maltreatment of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities and steps that we must take towards awareness, prevention, and intervention. Next slide, please. So there are just some key definitions I would like to emphasize before we delve into our discussion. So as we described earlier, child maltreatment encompasses all forms of abuse and neglect of a child under 18 years of age by essentially any individual that's responsible for the child's well-being and development. So this can be a parent, a caregiver, a teacher, and it boils down to a failure to meet the fundamental needs of the child and the violation of the child's well-being. And this can translate across many dimensions of abuse, such as physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. Special educational needs refer to a wide scope of needs, and these can extend from emotional and physical needs to mental and intellectual needs that ultimately create barriers to the child from benefiting from school education that's generally available and designed for children of the same age, without specialized support or adaptations in the light of studies. There's also neurodevelopmental disabilities, which are a group of conditions with an onset that characterizes the developmental period of childhood. So this can include deficits which lead to impaired functioning. And in the DSM-5, these include intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, neurodevelopmental motor disorders, and specific learning disorders. And as we mentioned earlier, adverse childhood experiences are any experiences that involve early childhood exposure to traumatic events. And this includes child abuse and neglect. And this has a physiological disruption on development, especially cognitive development, in such a way that permeates into adulthood and can inspire lifelong poor physical and mental health. Next slide, please. So what we're seeing is this overarching mechanism in which children with special educational needs due to neurodevelopmental disabilities so often fail to receive the support that's needed to nourish and sustain their well-being and development. And as a result, we're seeing this exacerbation of negative behaviors due to frustration and anxiety stemming from unmet needs and neglect. And in addition to weak social and communication skills, this can lead to a heavy burden on parents of disabled children who encounter greater stressors and caregiving demands, and this can lead to significantly more conflicts at home. And in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen this magnified stress and loss of integral financial and social support from schools and rehabilitation centers, which poses an increased risk for domestic violence, child abuse, and neglect. And as a result of the pandemic, we've also seen a severe impact on healthcare seeking patterns for child abuse and neglect. And it's especially likely that victims of maltreatment with neurodevelopmental disabilities fail to receive vital medical care. And this leads to an underreporting of severe injuries in the midst of the pandemic. So overall, this widespread lack of crucial social, financial, and emotional support needed to buffer the development of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities, which has been underscored by the pandemic, really poses vulnerable children with a greater risk of maltreatment and long-ranging physical and mental health struggles. Next slide, please. So we can take a closer glimpse into the problem, and some of the statistics that I really want to emphasize is that child abuse and neglect is at least 3 times higher in children with disabilities than in typically developing children. And over 80% of children with special educational needs were found to be victims of psychological aggression, with over 20% encountering at least one episode of severe physical assault and nearly 30% suffering from child neglect. And we can really see the impact of the pandemic when, compared with 2019, there was an increased percentage in emergency department visits related to child abuse and neglect, resulting in hospitalization. We also need to note that out of children with special educational needs, those with mental disorders such as autism and ADHD, and those with intellectual disorders encounter more emotional and behavioral difficulties, and general poor quality of life compared to children with other developmental disabilities. and overall poor psychosocial functioning. This also trails into the parents. Parents of children with mental and intellectual disorders are reported to have higher parental stress. And perhaps most strikingly, the parents of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities have significantly lower socioeconomic status in general. And when we consider the economic shutdowns following the pandemic, this really creates further barriers to receiving the vital and continued specialized healthcare, emotional, and educational support needed for children with disabilities. And so when we consider how neurodevelopmentally disabled children experience significantly more adverse childhood experiences, this really contributes to devastating long-term effects on physical, behavioral, and mental well-being. So in addition to irreversible changes in brain structure in the already vulnerable neurobiological development of disabled children, this really raises concerns about long-term morbidity across multiple organ systems, premature mortality, and overall a decrease in brain resilience and adaptivity to stress, and an increase in brain vulnerability. That's very alarming. Next slide, please. So this ties into risk factors that we need to consider when we're looking at how to combat the issue. And we know that due to the devastating ramifications of ACEs on neurobiological development and long-term physiological outcomes, specialized physical and mental health care is absolutely essential, but this can really place additional stress on parents to provide and find appropriate care. Also, we need to consider inadequate social support, along with the added impact of social distancing. Parents need greater time and resources to nourish their children, but this can have isolating effects without lack of connection between parents and fundamental support groups. This can really threaten parents' mental and emotional well-being and also place limits on their awareness of how to protect their children from maltreatment. Poverty also, as we discussed, parents of neurodevelopmentally disabled children are more likely to have lower socioeconomic status. And then this causes an array of stressors that can really add to the risk of maltreatment, as well as poverty accompanied by depression and substance abuse. So there are some protective factors that are essential to consider when tackling the issue. The comfort and willingness of parents to collaborate with pediatricians, social workers, and service professionals is absolutely needed. We also need improvements in screening for the detection of neurodevelopmental disabilities and pediatric intervention. Due to the pandemic, educators who played a vital role in identifying children with maltreatment had limitations, and so it's the pediatricians that have a special opportunity. And so by improving current ICD codes or providing specialized education on identifying maltreatment of children with disabilities and their unique displays, this can play a very powerful role. And we also need to cultivate strong support systems as a buffer for the mental health of parents, fostering connections between families of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And it's also vital to have further research on how we can optimize medical health care to enrich the brain development of children with disabilities. So the creation of disability-specific therapeutic, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches, psychiatric interventions is absolutely essential, along with extended psychiatric care under the context of a developmental approach to health, because disrupted psychiatric care can even worsen the emotional and behavioral difficulties that we're observing. So it's vital to ensure that there's this lasting foundation of care. Next slide, please. So there are many wonderful pre-pandemic interventions that have been made to combat this issue of maltreatment of children with disabilities. But we need to also acknowledge that there are severe limitations in these interventions because they do not account for research that's in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And due to the pandemic, there are obviously barriers in carrying these out. And so while there are many wonderful current interventions such as screening for disabilities, And I've listed some over here: community level prevention, family focused prevention, and child focused prevention, and utilizing training and awareness and different support systems to really overcome this issue. We also need to be able to understand how to optimize virtual platforms and strategies while still having a meaningful impact. And we also need to understand how we can modify these approaches to suit the specific needs of children with different disabilities. So special interventions for children with mental disorders versus intellectual disorders, and really refining these interventions to make a lasting impact. Next slide, please. So when we look at opportunities in public health impact, the most important thing is that we have this constellation of collaboration, because every individual plays a role in overcoming this issue. And so we need to weave together the role of the parent, the child, the primary pediatricians, which I mentioned have an especially important role in light of the pandemic, psychiatrists, social workers, and educators, all need to converge together and address the different elements together that are going to make a difference. And here I created almost a constellation of different goals that I believe can really make a powerful impact in solving this issue. And so I've summarized it in the network of different factors there. And also the American Academy of Pediatrics provided this wonderful graph of levels of support, of financial, extended care, medical and emotional support, and different interventions that we can use as guidelines to integrate when trying to overcome this issue. Next slide, please. So ultimately, we can build a brighter future for children with neurodevelopmental disabilities. We just need to take it one step at a time and piece together the different components that are going to make a difference. And I personally believe that the creation of an early childhood mental health system developed with a unique approach to intervention and prevention of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities is essential. And so if we root this early childhood mental health system in developing healthy family environments, promoting parent-child and family relationships, stable family routines, and parental mental health support, as well as, support by policies with access to key services and virtual strategies, comprehensive support, and also integrating proactive, trauma-informed, multidisciplinary care, embedding psychiatric and social service support within the primary pediatric care environment. I truly believe that we can transform the lives of children with developmental disabilities. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Meghna. Great job. I will open it up for questions or comments for Meghna.
I just want to say that I really love the that last slide that you had with the puzzle pieces. I really love the way that you laid that out. So
thank you. I was actually inspired because you know how there's this controversial belief that children who have disabilities are like pieces of a puzzle that need to be solved. But I believe it's not the children itself that need to be fixed. It's like the problems in the structure and the system. So that was what I was trying to convey.
I love that. That's amazing. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for sharing that, Meghna. I'm glad. Great question. I'm glad that gave the opportunity for us to learn that. Thank you.